Ishiro Honda once said that the tragedy of monsters is the fact that they are born too tall, too strong, and too heavy. And at least in the context of the films, he was right. These attributes have led to Godzilla having many disagreements with the Japanese military. But at least in the context of pop culture, these attributes have led to the opposite for Godzilla. They've allowed him to prosper and produce 28 movies. But I want to analyze this and discover what it truly is about Godzilla that attracts people to him and why he's been so endearing. And the only way to truly do that successfully is to review every Godzilla movie ever made. Some people might be angry, but regardless, welcome to Zazubaar's Godzilla Palooza. Greetings, youth of Japan. I am Zazubaar, and welcome back to Godzilla Palooza. It's day 12, and today we're taking a jump into the 70s. Oh yeah, the time of drugs, weird-looking clothes, and drugs. And hippies. Basically, today we're going to be taking a look at the 1971 film Godzilla vs. Hedorah, or more commonly known in America as Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. Godzilla vs. Hedorah was kind of a redemption after Godzilla's Revenge because Honda didn't want to do any more Godzilla movies, and also it was kind of a bouncing back point for the Godzilla films because E.G. Sabraya had unfortunately passed away in 1970, therefore his unquestionable excellence on the franchise can no longer be used. He hadn't been doing Godzilla for the past couple of years, but still, he will be missed, and the films lose his charm, definitely in the Showa series at least, without him around to at least supervise the effects. So, bouncing back a year later, Godzilla had to kind of make a little bit of a change. They had to kind of find a way to marry the campiness that they were going for with Godzilla's Revenge and Son of Godzilla, and also, in some way, marketed to older kids, because I think Godzilla's Revenge low sales showed to Toho we can't make it that goofy. But I think they had to make it campy in some way. So, I feel like this, with Godzilla vs. Hedorah, we're starting kind of a new tone for Godzilla. I like to refer to everything after Destroy All Monsters as the late Showa series, in that these movies feel very different from what we had before Destroy All Monsters. I feel like everything from Godzilla's Revenge onward feels like its own different thing. Still definitely Godzilla, but a new kind of Godzilla. This is the Godzilla that's kind of suffering from Gamera syndrome, and that Godzilla really started to kind of fall out of popularity in the late 60s and early 70s. And the big reason for that was, of course, Gamera. Gamera was really popular amongst kids and was kind of stealing the spotlight from the Big G. So Toho decided that to compete with Gamera, they decided to try the same thing and tried to make Godzilla a superhero. And Godzilla vs. Hedorah is the first movie that tries to do that. And that it's the first movie where Godzilla is a full-fledged superhero and not a monster anymore, really. He's not, like, as loved as Gamera is, I suppose is the best way to put it, but he's still definitely a superhero and not that badass force of destruction anymore. So, on to more Godzilla vs. Hedorah specifically, being the first movie in that late Showa series that kind of establishes that tone, it's freaking weird. the tone of this thing is kind of like a 70s acid trip with Godzilla thrown in. It is just bizarre. And watching it, I kind of felt like I was on an acid trip, and that every single scene is just something weird, and the music is weird, the imagery is weird. The opening credits felt like some kind of seizure-induced hallucination caused by like an acid overdose or something. And it's just really bizarre and just doesn't feel like a Godzilla movie. And I don't want to call it bad because I just think it's weird. And again, I can't call it bad because it's really not. It's just weird, and I didn't really... When I first saw this movie, I didn't expect it. And I've only seen this movie a handful of times, I'll admit. It's in fact one of the later films I ever saw. And really the one thing that stuck out to me and made it one of my least favorite Godzilla films is the fact, and I don't want to say bad, I want to say I don't watch it that often, is the tone. It's just so goddamn weird. From the music to just the editing, everything is weird. And it doesn't feel like the kind of Godzilla I like. And the tone is different, and Godzilla's characterization is different. And also, this starts the problem I'm going to have with this later Showa series of Godzilla really doesn't have that much of an impact on the plot. And we'll get into that in a minute, but this feels very different, and the weirdness of it definitely draws me away from it. And I know that's kind of a personal thing, I'll admit, but it really is one of the things that doesn't quite kill the movie, but makes it difficult for me to sit through it and say that I like it, because I'm gonna be honest, I really don't like this movie, but it really is the tone that kills it for me. It's how weird it is. And otherwise, this is just kind of a good monster, or I don't want to say good, a decent monster movie. So I suppose I should get into the background of how this whole idea of Hedorah came about. Hedorah is, of course, not mysteriously a monster created by pollution. I mean, the American title is Godzilla vs. the Smog Monster. And the whole idea of it was the director of this film, and I believe he also wrote the screenplay, Yoshimitsu Banno. This is the first Godzilla movie since since King Kong vs. Godzilla, not written by Senkichi Sekizawa, and it definitely shows the plot progression and everything about it feels very different. I think that's why we have a very different tone from the other Showa series, and from the earlier stuff. And this just feels very weird. It's written by Yoshimitsu Banno, who wanted to kind of capture a very hot button issue at the time with pollution, and particularly people in Japan getting asthma from industrial pollution. And he kind of wanted to cover that with a Godzilla movie by creating a monster, that was kind of born out of that pollution. And, kind of have an anti-pollution message in the movie. So that's how Hedorah came about, and that's why the movie is the way it is, and why there's so much pollution in the plot. And why nearly every single scene has some but some long and drawn-out shot with music playing of just pollution. So that's really it. I mean, basically, Yoshimitsu Banno wanted to cover a hot-button issue with pollution with a Godzilla movie and created a monster, Hedorah, to fight Godzilla that would be representative of that. But the other thing he kind of wanted to capture with this movie, at least I think, he's never said this. He's talked about the pollution thing before, but he's never come out and said this in interviews and stuff, is that I think he was trying to capture the youth generation with this Godzilla movie. This is kind of a Godzilla movie for those 70s hippies who were protesting the government and having all these environmental active kind of things, and that it's a Godzilla movie for them, and that the movie's main cast, aside from a scientist and his wife and his son, is all teenagers, all 70s clubbing teenagers who are kind of hippies. I mean, they're not as stereotypical hippies as kind of Americans were at the time, but they definitely have that thing going on. And just the things they do in their spare time is very telling of that. Like, they go to clubs, they do drugs and drink, and we don't see them do drugs, but we do see them drink, and I think the drug thing is definitely implied. And we also see like these weird hallucinations that the main teenager guy has. And fine, do all that, Yoshimitsu Banno. I don't care. It's a good idea. We're taking the Godzilla series back to its roots in a kind of way. We're going back to social commentary. Go for it. I love it. but don't make it this weird and this forced. My biggest problem with Godzilla vs. Hedorah, aside from the weirdness, is the fact that everything is shoved down your throat. I know not everyone's gonna agree, wink wink Adam, but the big thing for me on why this movie doesn't really work for me, aside from the weirdness, is the fact that everything is shoved down your throat. I didn't really need all these long shots of pollution. I didn't really need all these long sequences of people singing about saving the earth and weird drug-induced hallucinations about people having fish heads and just all this kind of stuff, and all these strangely edited scenes of like cartoon images like of Hedorah drinking pollution and like attack. It's weird, and it's just bizarre and like comes off as very PSA kind of thing, and I don't like that with a Godzilla movie. Because Godzilla was always about very subtle social and political and, you know, environmental, I guess in this case, kind of allegory. And I mean, the original Gojira doesn't have one image of a nuclear explosion in it. Yet this film is filled with images of pollution. And I don't mean to hold this film up to high standards of the original, although I kind of am doing that, but you know, there's just so much, like, shoving down your throats of, oh, look at the pollution, look at it, and, you know, just, like, all these strange, like, cartoon images, and it distracts from the story. And I feel like with any good movie, you should be doing this, especially if you're doing an allegory, which this definitely is an allegory, is you should have the plot first, know what you're gonna do with the allegory, but construct a plot first. You know, what's gonna happen. And then when you have the story, you have to sprinkle kind of this little layer on top of real-world events and, you know, thematic stuff that makes both seem like that one couldn't exist without the other. We had that with the original Gojira, and we had that with Mothra versus Godzilla. Godzilla vs. Hedorah doesn't really have that, in that the plot is very reliant on the allegory, and that's not necessarily a huge problem, except for the whole shoving down your throats thing. They take it too far, kind of, in a way. In that, you know, okay, we've got this allegory, and then we're constructing a plot, but it's almost like we start constructing the plot, then we start sprinkling too much allegory, and it stops becoming allegory, and it starts becoming a PSA. And then the movie is not a movie anymore. Now it's just basically a commercial for some anti-pollution active society thing. And that's not how you make a good movie, because then you're starting to pull your audience away from the movie, which a movie, again, as I talked about this in extent on my last review, so I'm going to just say it briefly here. A movie needs to suck in the audience and make them feel like they're a part of the movie. And Godzilla vs. Revenge was much worse at doing that than Godzilla vs. Hedorah is. I mean, Godzilla vs. Hedorah is at least telling a story and at least feels like a cinematic experience, but the problem is that when you start shoving all these ideas down your audience's throat, you're kind of condescending them and making them, I don't know how to describe it, but you're kind of condescending to them. And I don't like that, and that doesn't make for good cinema. It just makes for a really great PSA. So with all that stuff said, let's get into the plot more specifically, since I feel like I'm not giving you guys enough detail to fully support my critiques. So let's go into the plot. Basically what happens is there's this monster born from pollution called Hedorah. It starts sinking ships, then starts to absorb more pollution, starts to become bigger. Godzilla shows up to try and kill it. It keeps getting bigger, goes on a rampage as a flying saucer, kills a bunch of people, goes up to Mount Fuji where the military is trying to come up with a plan to stop it, being helped by the scientist father of our main child protagonist in the film. Yeah, we got another child protagonist. Who comes up with an idea to use basically electricity to kill them. Well, I forget what they call it. It's basically they want to dry the monster up because it's basically made of sludge. So if they dry it up, it'll die. That's basically the idea. Godzilla returns to try and fight it. Hedorah attacks a youth group on Mount Fuji. The military tries to attack Hedorah with this thing. It doesn't work because the power circuits break. Godzilla tries to help by holding Hedorah down and using his atomic breath to make the machine work. At first it seems to work, but then Hedorah is reborn. Godzilla flies. Yeah, he flies. This is the movie. We'll get to that. Godzilla starts fighting him again, beats the ever-living shit out of him, takes him back to the machine, fires his atomic breath again, and then this time it works, and just to make sure he's done, Godzilla rips Hedorah into pieces and then burns all the sludge, and then lights everything on fire with his atomic breath. And then Godzilla returns to the sea, and we're left with a surprisingly and, in a good way, not optimistic ending. I mean, the music doesn't help that, but the scenery and the shots really kind of support a we messed up kind of ending. Kind of like the original Gojira, just not as solemn and not as impactful, but we'll get to that in a sec. So that's basically the plot. I actually really like it, and here's why. It's a really classic and definitely effective monster story, and it manages to be frightening, imaginative, excuse me, I'm having one of those days, it's kind of imaginative, and it's frightening like any good monster movie should be. My only problem with the plot, and this is just talking about Hedorah's story, about, him being born, him attacking, and, dealing with all this pollution stuff, is the fact that it's a Godzilla movie. And it's called Godzilla vs. Hedorah. So, this is a Godzilla movie, so he is technically, by definition, the title and main character. So, I feel like he needs to have at least some significance to the plot. And he really doesn't. I mean, he just kind of shows up to fight Hedorah. And while he does technically kill Hedorah in the end, that's it. He is kind of just a big gun in this movie. And he is kind of, again, he is a superhero. But superheroes generally have a connection with their villains, and Godzilla doesn't really have much of a connection with Hedorah. He just seems to show up to fight him because he's bad and because he's killing people. And, that's kind of the stereotypical superhero thing to do. And, again, fair enough, but again, he's the title character. He needs to have some impact on the story. It could be any monster in this. It could be Gamera. It could be Kong. But, it just happens to be a Godzilla movie, so he's the one who's got to kill the monster in the end. And I just wish he had more stuff to do than that. I apologize for me having these long pauses. I'm just having a really hard time not knowing where to start, but not knowing what to say about this one. Because it is one that's just so weird, and one that I haven't seen that many times, and one that I never really had much of a connection with, that I don't really have a lot to say about it. I just think that it's strange, and that's really the big detractor for me, is the fact that it's so weird. And that's really why I haven't seen it that many times, and why I'm having a hard time coming up with these things to say, because it is just so weird that I have no connection to it. And the fact of the matter is that since Godzilla has a sizable amount of screen time, but a lot of it is just him staring at the camera and just roaring. It's nothing of him doing anything very impactful. It really is just kind of just him kind of staring into space, and that doesn't really count. I mean, it counts as screen time, but it doesn't count as him doing anything. So that's really why I don't have a lot of connection to it, is that Godzilla doesn't really have a lot of connection to it either, so I don't have a lot of connection to it. So the other thing I want to say about the plot is that it's really strangely paced, in that the first kind of two acts of, building up to Hedorah's first attack, and then the third act, which is ending Hedorah being destroyed, is that the first two acts move really well and move really quick. The last act drags like nobody's business. That last scene on Mount Fuji feels like it takes days. And not days in movie time, days in people time, in that the movie literally feels like I'm sitting there for days watching this event take place. And I don't like that. I'll be honest, I was getting really antsy with the ending of this movie, because it is just so long and drawn out and not very interesting. And, that's the main thing, is that the first two acts are really nicely paced and very natural, but then the third act is really draggy. So that's really the big kink in the plot, is that the first two acts move very well and move pretty naturally, and then the third act is just so draggy. So that's really all I have to say about the plot. It's just that it's quite simple, which is good for a monster movie and good for one that's trying to have a lot of allegory in it, but it's just not paced very well. Again, it feels like the first two acts move fine, and the third one is moving like a snail. So I don't like that about it. The other thing that kind of bogs the story down is the weirdness. I know I've been saying that this movie is weird this entire review, but the part where the weird stuff really starts to hurt the movie is in the plot, because there are just these scenes devoted to just weird music and, you know, just weird images that really don't have any impact on the story or on the allegory, and it just bogs the movie and the plot down and hurts the pacing. And then it doesn't feel like it's moving naturally anymore. Now it just feels like it's moving, I don't know how to describe it, unnaturally maybe, but it just, these scenes are unnecessary and they bog the movie down. That scene in the club has no impact on the story. Just Hedorah shows up, there's a weird dance scene with drinking and fish heads, and then bam, Hedorah shows up and we've got a Godzilla fight underway. What the hell? The other ones that really stick out to me are the scenes of our main Japanese child protagonist. Yeah, we've got another, we have another child protagonist here named Ken. His dad explaining to him these different nebulas and galaxies. And we'll get into this a little more when we talk about Hedorah's origin, because it is really confusing. But again, it's unnecessary. And him talking about the way these galaxies and nebulas and meteorites work is just unnecessary and, again, bogs the plot down. The third and final one is the cartoons. These little animated kind of short images that seem to have something to do with the pollution allegory, but really don't have any impact on the plot or on the characters. They just kind of happen, they end, and then the movie gets going again. It's really weird. The final thing I want to say about the plot is the tone of the thing. The film's tone is actually quite strong, especially in the beginning of the film, where it is it's a very dark kind of monster movie. And the tone is very dark, all the characters are taking everything very seriously, Hedorah is quite frightening, and all the plot elements in the film are building up to this very frightening monster encounter. The scene where Hedorah shows up for the first time on four legs and attacks an industrial area is really quite frightening. And the images of it and the tone of it and the fact that it's shot at night is really scary. So I really like that. And the film does, for the most part, carry on that tone, but the problem is the monster scenes and the music. Especially Godzilla. Godzilla does some really goofy things in this movie, and the music complements them. And again, it hurts the movie's tone, which for the most part is going for a very serious one. Like the scene where Godzilla flies, I know I'll talk about it in a minute when we get into Godzilla's characterization, but it's weird and does not fit at all in with the movie, and that the movie is going for a very serious tone, but then you've got all these goofy elements in it that just don't fit. Like the scene with Godzilla flying. So that hurts the movie's tone. Otherwise, though, I do like it. I like it. I like it as a serious Godzilla movie, but it is inconsistent. Let's talk about the humans more specifically. Let's talk about Ken himself, the main protagonist of the film, the child. I like him a lot better than Ichiro in that he isn't annoying. He really doesn't talk that much, and he has this very solemn expression on his face, kind of like he feels like he's kind of the final child in the world, and I really like that. Like, this child is the last one who's gonna see this world. Like, this movie doesn't have a very kind of apocalyptic kind of feel to it, where it feels like the pollution is gonna destroy the world. And kind of like this child is the last hope of the future, and that he has this solemn look on his face the whole movie. And that kind of helps the movie in that you kind of feel for him. Like, I don't really know how to describe it. Like, he and the audience know that he's kind of like the last child of Earth, like the last chance for a better future, and he's slowly being constricted by the pollution and by industry and by society and all this, and he's really trying hard to remain innocent and be a better hope for the future. So I like him. He doesn't really have a lot to do. He's not annoying, but he is a little bit, he's kind of a geeky shut-in. And, well, and fair enough, I mean, I'm a geeky shut-in, but, I don't know, he's not a good protagonist to follow, only because he's not very proactive, and he just doesn't do anything of really any worth. He just kind of looks at the screen very solemnly. He does name Hedorah, though, so fair enough, but he's just not very interesting. The rest of the cast is just really unmemorable. His scientist father is interesting, likable, and a little bit tragic in that he loses half of his face to Hedorah, but he doesn't really do anything that's entirely all that interesting. He doesn't really have anything interesting to say, but he's kind of sympathetic with that he gets half of his face burned off, so I like that about him, and otherwise, though, the rest of the cast is just really unmemorable. There's no actors that I can really note in this movie that you might know. There's no one that I can think of that I would know. So that kind of adds to the unmemorable aspects of them, too. The movie, the human cast overall is really unmemorable. So unmemorable, that ultimately does hurt the movie for me in that makes it less memorable and, kind of bunks it down on the list of good Godzilla films, and that, the cast is so unmemorable. So on to the monsters. Let's talk about Hedorah first, since he is kind of the main monster. I really like Hedorah. He's really scary, and his look and his roar and what he does, it's all very frightening. I love the way he moves. He moves in a very creepy fashion, and he moves in kind of like a scary kind of creeping up kind of creature, and he's very unpredictable, and he moves. I love the way he moves. He's also very unique. There's nothing else like him in the Godzilla universe. He's just basically a big blob of crap, and there's nothing else that looks like him, and that makes him very distinct and quite memorable. He's really the most memorable aspect of the movie in that he is just so damn creepy looking. And there's nothing else like him in the Godzilla universe. I also really like his roar. It's not the most distinct thing ever, but it is quite terrifying and fits his design, like all Godzilla monsters should. Again, since it fits the design, I have to give it props for that. So I love the roar, and I like Hedorah in general. Let's talk about his origin, though. I have a big problem with Hedorah's origin because we get two different origins for him in this movie. One is the basic one of, we overpolluted the Earth, so now we've got this monster who's born from pollution. I like that well enough. It's kind of similar to Godzilla's origin. But then a second explanation is thrown out, that he's an alien that is in fact spawning off the Earth's pollution and getting bigger by it. What the hell? There is no indication that Hedorah is an alien except for some theory by the main scientist in the film, Ken's dad. And, there's no indication that he's an alien, and it's only brought up in one scene. Otherwise, it just seems to be, we created this thing from pollution. I also kind of resist the whole alien thing only because the strong point of this movie is the allegory, and it's really kind of ruined if Hedorah is in fact an alien. So I resist it. It's only in one scene. Otherwise, it seems to be pretty static on Hedorah being a creation born of pollution. But I really resist the idea of him being an alien, and it does really hurt the film's plot in that we don't really know. And I kind of like the idea of Hedorah's origins being a little bit of a mystery. Like, we don't know quite how he was born. We know he has something to do with pollution, but I'd be satisfied enough with that. And I like the idea of having multiple theories thrown out, but I didn't really need it. Like, I just kind of think that his is a really basic origin. Here's a monster born from pollution. That's all you need. We didn't need all this stuff of, he might be from space. Or, he might have been a tadpole that got mutated by pollution. That's not said in the film, but that's just to throw out an example of what could have been. I didn't need it. All I needed was he's born from pollution. That's it. Move on with the rest of the story. Didn't need the alien thing. And since it's only in one scene, I can't quite say that that's his distinctive origin, that he's an alien being that got bigger with pollution. There's no indication of that. Except for that one scene. There's nothing in his personality or in his features that even kind of promotes the idea of him being an alien, except for the parts where he turns into a flying saucer, but even then, still doesn't mean he's an alien. So I resist the idea of Hedorah being an alien. I think it's just ultimately a weird plot element that doesn't really go anywhere, therefore I think you should kind of ignore it. But otherwise, Hedorah is cool, unique looking, and he's one of the most unique monsters in the Godzilla universe, and I really like him. He's definitely the best part of the movie, and I really like the way he looks. I like his roar. I like everything about him, except for that kind of shaky origin. So I think we better start talking about the other monster in the movie. What's his name again? Oh yeah, Godzilla. This is Godzilla's first time as a superhero, and I'm not gonna say that it comes out of nowhere, because it doesn't. I mean, Godzilla's been kind of an anti-hero ever since Ghidorah, which was 7 years ago. So I don't have a problem with him being a superhero. The only thing I have a problem with is that he has no impact on the plot, and that he is just kind of a big gun. He was never a big gun before this. He was always at a certain place, at a certain time, either for a reason, or fought the other monster for a reason. In Hedorah, he just kind of shows up to kill Hedorah, or he shows up to deal with Hedorah. And I don't like that he just kind of shows up with no given explanation to just kind of be a superhero and save the day. I don't like that. He is ultimately cool, and of course, I mean, Godzilla's always cool. I mean, there's not a movie where I don't like Godzilla. So he's fine in this, it's just he doesn't have enough impact on the plot. And my other big problem, and this is going to get bigger with the rest of the Showa series, even the good ones like Terror of Mechagodzilla, is that Godzilla does not have enough impact on the story. The human characters barely mention his name, except for the kid. He has little impact on the military. He has little impact on the people. I feel like Godzilla should always have an impact on the people, and that they never talk about him, they just talk about the other monster. I don't like that. It feels too much like what was going on with the Gamera series, and that in some Gamera films, the people who the main characters barely mention Gamera's name, and it's the same way in Hedorah and for the most of the rest of the Showa series. So I don't like that. So I really don't like how little impact Godzilla has in this movie. I wish he had a bigger impact on the story. So I really don't have a lot to say about him, only because he's not really integral to the plot. And makes me wishing that this movie wouldn't have been called Godzilla vs. Hedorah, that this movie would have been called Hedorah, the Smog Monster. Wouldn't that have been great? I think this movie would be so much better, and I wouldn't be giving it the same critiques that I'm giving it if it wasn't a Godzilla movie. I probably wouldn't even be able to call it not that good if it wasn't a Godzilla movie, because Godzilla's lack of impact on the story is really the weakest link in why I'm going to give it the score I'm going to give it, because of what we're reviewing it in Godzilla Palooza. If Godzilla wasn't in this movie would work so much better. I just think it would have been a good monster movie then, or at least a decent one. So let's get on to the theme and allegory, easily the biggest thing in the movie. So let's talk about that. So, the big thing is, of course, pollution and its effects and why it's bad. That's really the main theme of the film. It's basically, Hedorah is basically representing the overpollution and the effects of pollution and how they can affect people, how they can affect the environment. I mean, when Hedorah flies around in his flying saucer form for the first time, he goes around flying over people and they suffocate to death and turn to bones. I like that, well, I don't like that, but that's just because of the asthma thing, that, you know, pollution suffocates your lungs and gives you asthma. So it's a nice touch. It's not as subtle as some other stuff can be. Though I do ultimately like it, and, you know, I think it's a nice touch. I like the idea of Hedorah releasing sulfuric acid, and that, again, it represents the impacts of pollution. And the big thing that makes the allegory strong in Godzilla vs. Hedorah is the fact that not only do we get the effects of pollution, but we get the bad effects of the pollution. And that, in a similar way to the original Gojira, we get the bad effects of pollution, and that helps support the film's idea of, hey, we gotta cut this out, kind of like the original Gojira was. It's not as strongly because it's a lot more shoved down your throat than the original Gojira was, but I like the effort. I think it's strong enough, and it's relatively well handled. But in the end of the film, near the end, I didn't find myself wanting to go out there and stop pollution. And I think the big reason for why is that it was such a hot-button issue at the time that the allegory doesn't really mean anything to me on a personal level. It just kind of feels like, oh, cool. It's pollution. I don't have anything to say about it because I wasn't around at the time, and it's gone now, I guess, so cool. I know pollution is still around and it's still a big problem, but the way this movie prevents it, it doesn't feel like that. It feels very timely, and I don't like that. The original Gojira was dealing with an issue of the time of atomic bombs, but it was more timeless than that because it wasn't as much shoved down your throat. The thing that hurts this movie is that it is so shoved down your throat, and at points the allegory outweighs the story. And that's what makes this film feel shoved down your throat and not as good as films like the original Gojira and as other monster movies that have allegory in them. And that it is so shoved down your throat, and that helps it have a timeless quality to it. I don't think I would be having the same problem with this movie if I was reviewing it back in 1971, but the thing is that I'm not. So, if you watch this movie today, the allegory is going to seem really shoved down your throat and really outdated. So it's way too preachy for its own good. I do think it's relatively well handled. I like how we see the bad effects of it, but I just think it's too preachy. And the big thing for me is, again, the fact that it seems the allegory outweighs the story. The cartoon scenes are a good example of that, and, you know, the scenes where Hedorah was, like, drinking out of an oil tanker and stuff. And also the fact that we get so many kind of beauty shot-esque shots of pollution. And, I don't love that about it. And also the opening credits are kind of like a James Bond-esque opening credits, in that we get, an actual vocal song for the film. And the whole opening credits is sung to, pictures of pollution and images of this girl dancing in front of like a lava lamp-esque thing with images of pollution. And it's kind of like a James Bond-esque thing, and again, it kind of shoves the film down your throat, or the theme down your throat. It's kind of like if the original Gojira had opening credits of a woman dancing in front of pictures of atomic bombs exploding. So it's a lot more shoved down your throat than other films. Or if Mothra vs. Godzilla, the opening credits were like girls dancing around pictures of money. So it just doesn't work, and it's too preachy, and that's one of the things why I don't like it, is because it is so preachy and kind of pushes me away from the movie. I kind of want to start wrapping this review up because it's getting really long. The last thing I want to talk about the movie is the editing, and we'll talk about the music in this too because it does affect it. The editing in this film is really strange. I don't want to call it bad, I want to call it poor. In that, editing is poor when the editing distracts you from the movie and takes you out of it. There are just a lot of strange cuts and shots in this movie, like, there's this one shot where, a building kind of crumbles and there's no sound effect or music or anything. It's just kind of the video of the building crumbling. The other shot that always stuck out to me was this shot where it's like this news broadcast and there's all these interviews of people talking about how they should kill Hedorah. And it's like all these multiple TVs on screen at once with all these people yelling at the same time and all these strange Technicolor light shows going on. And pictures of Godzilla fighting Hedorah. It's just, what the hell am I looking at? Oh, it is like an acid trip. And I'm gonna call this Godzilla the Acid Trip. It just drives me insane. Sorry, it's just, the editing is just so weird. And is ultimately my biggest detractant from the film and why I don't like it. It's just the editing is so weird, and really hurts the movie in my opinion because it is so weird and really takes you out of the movie. It also doesn't feel like a Godzilla movie in that it is so strangely edited. Like the editing almost like overshadows Godzilla, and I don't like that. And the music too adds to this problem in that at some points the music is quite good. Like I like Hedorah's theme. I think the music during the scene where he fights Godzilla is fine, but the music itself doesn't really fit the tone at points. Like sometimes it does when it's a little bit creepy, but the parts where it doesn't fit the tone are the points where it is really goofy, like when Godzilla flies. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention that. Let me touch on that really quick. Yeah, Godzilla flies in this movie. And it doesn't make any fucking sense. He basically puts his head down, starts breathing fire, and then cocks his head up and starts moving really quick across the skyline. It doesn't make any sense because there's nothing supporting him, you know, like there's no hovering. Like, I don't understand how it works. Godzilla, the way the film presents it, should be skidding on the ground from his atomic breath, not using it to fly. The other thing is that if Godzilla used his atomic breath like this, and the implications that the film has in that the atomic breath can propel him up, then every time Godzilla fires his atomic breath, he should have some kind of recoil from it. And he never does. So, you know, it doesn't make any sense with the continuity of Godzilla, and just, it's a stupid scene. It doesn't make any goddamn sense, and I just wish it was cut out of the movie. It's just so stupid. And going back to the music in that scene really hurts the tone because it makes the movie feel really goofy when the rest of it is presented as a very serious Godzilla film. So it doesn't work in that regard. So the music kind of works, but and kind of fits the tone, but at too many points it's too goofy, and really makes the movie feel less serious than it is. So that's really all I have to say about Godzilla vs. Hedorah. It's not one of my favorites, even kind of. I think it's poorly edited. The allegory is shoved down your throat, and Godzilla's barely involved in the story, which is a problem because it is a Godzilla movie. And it's just so weird that it makes me not want to watch it because it's just so fucking weird. I'll give the movie this. It's definitely distinct and memorable. That doesn't mean it's good. It's definitely distinct and memorable though. But I don't want to call this movie bad. Because the fact that it has allegory, and has kind of effective allegory, and the fact that, it's a mostly serious film, and Hedorah is a cool monster, and it's quite frightening. It's not bad. It's not good, though, either. So, since it is kind of an in-the-middle kind of Godzilla movie, and that it has both elements that are really quite good and really quite bad, and they both kind of even each other out, I'm going to give this movie an average score of 2.5 out of 5. I don't know if I recommend it. It is so weird, and is so Godzilla not really affecting the plot, that I don't know if you're going to like it if you're a Godzilla fan. I think it really depends on you. So I say view at your own risk. It's not great, but it's not terrible. So I give it a 2.5 out of 5. It's average. It's this kind of a mediocre monster movie in the end, just with a really, really weird tone and music and soundtrack. So view at your own risk, really. So that'll about do it for this review of Godzilla vs. Hedorah. Tomorrow on Godzilla Palooza, we're going to continue on with this strange acid trip 70s kind of tone of Godzilla films. And Godzilla's still going to be a superhero next time, when we get into the introduction of one of Godzilla's most famous and popular enemies, Godzilla vs. Gigan from 1972. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys tomorrow for that review. Sayonara.
生き物みんないなくなって野も山も黙っちまった地球の上に誰もいなけりゃ泣くこともできない